Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of October 10th, 2024. We are recording this week from the Bibliomania Division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is historian Evan Frith. Evan is a professor of history at James Madison University. He earned a PhD in history from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, a master's degree from New York University, and a bachelor's in history from the University of Maryland. Evan is the author of 3 books: The Cycling City, Bicycles and Urban America in the 1890s, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015, On Bicycles, a 200-year history of cycling in New York City, published by Columbia University Press in 2019, and his most recent book, and the one he's here to talk about with me today, a terrific new book entitled The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore, published on August 6th of this year by Viking. It was reviewed by Michael Durdaw in the Washington Post on August 1st, by Alexandra Jacobs in the New York Times on August 4th, and in the Wall Street Journal by Daniel Axt on August 9th. All 3 of these national publications, along with many others, including the New Yorker and People magazine, gave it rave reviews. Anyone who has listened to this podcast or read anything I've written about knows how much I love books and bookstores, and I am delighted to be able to talk to Evan Frith today about his new book. My conversation with Evan Frith begins now. Evan Frith, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, you've written a book about bookshops, and your previous books were on bicycles, bicycling in the 1890s, and sort of a history of cycling in New York City. One thing that comes across loud and clear in your book that jumped out at me right away is definitely a love for New York City. Is that where you're from? Is that where you grew up? Clearly, that's a place that is very near and dear to you.
So I descend from a long line of New Yorkers, and I was born there, although mostly reared in suburban Baltimore in a town called Columbia, Maryland, which has its own interesting history as one of these planned suburbs in the late 1960s that was very much supposed to be the kind of antithesis to suburbs at that time. But I went to graduate school in New York and was living there, and both the book project and the bicycle project were very much shaped by my experience living in New York, studying American history and trying to think, and reflect on my own life and the historical decisions that made it difficult to be a bicyclist in New York City, and thinking about how bookstores came to be and why they had been disappearing over the course of my lifetime. And I rode my bike to get around everywhere. And my girlfriend got a job at a bookstore. So these were 2 worlds that I learned and got to know and fell in love with. So they combined with my interest in history for these books.
What reaction did you get from your colleagues in academia when you told them that you were writing a history of the bookshop? Because I suspect the reaction from your colleagues and from the general public may have been quite different. Maybe not. I don't know. You tell me.
Well, I will say this is a subject, unlike bicycles, that most academics have some love for themselves.
True.
So, especially in a history department, we are serious readers. At James Madison, where I teach, we moved into a new building some years ago, and we met with architects. And the one thing we said over and over again was we need a lot of bookshelf space. And we in the English department are very proud of our muscular shelves and all the books on them. So I think there's a lot of lay interest in bookstores for anybody who loves reading, and that carries through academia as well. There always is this tension being a professor of history, and the tension is, are we writing for each other or are we writing for the general public? And of course, many of us want to do both and contribute scholarship and research that resonates with our peers, but also draws a wider audience. So some of the reaction, a lot of it was very supportive. People liked the project. People thought had an inherent interest in it. But it also, I think, struck people as something very challenging and a very big and broad subject that most academics wouldn't touch and tend to focus on smaller topics and have a narrower focus chronologically, geographically, and thematically.
My first thought, if I heard that an academic historian was writing a history of bookshops, is this is really going to be heavily theory driven, and it's going to be inaccessible and inapproachable, and your book is anything but. We mentioned before we went on the air that this book first came to my attention by Michael Durdaw's wonderful Washington Post review of this book on August 1st. And he says the same thing, that you clearly know your way around an archive, but you love bookshops and you write about them in a way that invites the reader in. And I think you would call yourself a public historian, I think.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that and for the review in the Washington Post and everyone else who's said very nice things about the book. It's strange to hear, but certainly appreciated. And I've always wanted this project to be narrative, and there is a lot of academic literature on the history of the book as a material object and
Mm-hmm.
the history of printing and the ways in which reading cultures have changed over time, much of which is excellent and I read as background for this book. But there wasn't a lot of even academic or popular literature on the spaces themselves where books are being sold. And as somebody who was primarily interested in urban history and spaces, this was really the angle that appealed to me. And of course, book history is part of it, but it's also a history about the spaces, the atmosphere, the interactions between the people working there, the people shopping there. So that was the draw. And over the course of my own career, I've just been drawn to more narrative driven history. And I can look back at stuff I wrote in graduate school and be very embarrassed about how hard I try to sound smart and use lots of big words and employ what I thought were sophisticated theoretical framings and concepts. And um, I eventually got over that, I guess, and became what I think all of us are drawn to, even us who become professors of history in the first place, which are stories.
Mm-hmm.
That's our love of history is hearing about people and places and things that were spaces that were different than we know, or familiarizing them and making them normal in a way, but is really a discipline fundamentally about storytelling. And I was excited to try and write more popular styled book that would have appeal outside of the academy.
Your first two books were published by academic presses, I think. This one is published by Viking. Did you have a finished manuscript that you shopped around and then landed at Viking? Presuming you had an agent, but I wondered how you think originally as you were writing this, I'll look for an academic press, or from the beginning were you thinking commercial?
I wasn't sure. I was hoping that it was viable for a commercial trade press, but I was also aware that it's very hard to land in that world and that one needs an agent and then the agent has to find a willing editor and publisher. So I was hoping for it, but I really wasn't sure. And I wrote a couple of really one sample chapter and a full proposal of the book, which wasn't exactly what the book turned out to be, but more or less was, an accurate forecast of what was forthcoming. And I sent it around to my former editor of one of the university press books, my advisor, my wife, and a friend, and got various kind of feedback, most of which was positive. And I knew I could go the academic route and had done that twice and had good experiences and loved my editors and thought that they improved the book. But I got enough positive encouragement that made me think it maybe was viable and worth trying to land an agent, which again I had heard was a kind of Herculean task. And subsequently learned that it takes seemingly a lot of luck. And the agent that I landed has gets hundreds of queries every single week, and they have to be filtered through her assistant, to
Hmm.
make the kind of first cut. And I really just felt lucky and got a few agents who were interested. And even then, I wasn't sure if they were going to be able to pitch it, to an editor, but somehow it all worked out. And part of the appeal, of course, is that it's about books and bookstores, and that people in publishing, even if they were going to toss the proposal in the trash, they might have tossed it. It might have taken them a couple of seconds before tossing it rather than a bunch of other subjects that might not have any immediate appeal. So
Hmm.
that was part of the pitch.
Yeah.
And somehow it worked out.
Did you get any advance notice that this was going to be reviewed not only by the Washington Post, but 3 days later in the New York Times?
So my fantastic publicist at Viking, her name is Carolyn, and she sends, advanced copies of the book out everywhere. And I don't really know how she knows whether something's happening or not, but usually I got tipped off slightly beforehand because in the case of the Washington Post and some of the others, they want images from the book to appear in print. And so they're double checking about permissions. So for those, I knew that there was one in the pipeline, but usually only a couple of days ahead of time or shortly beforehand. And then, of course, one one never knows if it's going to be a good review or not. But for somebody like me who's not, let's say, Doris Kearns Goodwin or David McCullough, like for those kind of authors, a bad review can sting. I mean, a bad review can sting anyone, but can really hurt their sales. But for somebody like me who has, four Twitter followers or something, the fact that the book is getting reviewed in the Washington Post and the New York Times and the New Yorker and People
Hmm.
Magazine is a win already. So I
And,
was
and
already pretty excited.
and this may seem like a strange question to ask because I think authors just want to be read, right? But what does that feel like as an academically trained historian to see your book in People magazine and places like that? Are you because I mean, in our profession, a lot of times academic historians kind of look down their noses at people who are doing what you're able to do, which is reach a wide audience through a commercial press, and their book is noticed in places besides the Journal of American History. So, what has
Yeah,
that been like?
it's been mostly surprising. Um, yeah, there aren't that many of us, serious historians who find their book reviewed in People magazine. That was surprising. And that one I wasn't tipped off about, or I think my publicist said that she thought the book was getting reviewed, but somebody walked in. We were having a party to celebrate the launch of the book, and somebody walked in and congratulated me on being the book of the week in People magazine. And I had no idea what they were talking about and thought that they were probably just honestly, I thought they were confused and
Mm,
mistaken. And I
mm.
sent my parents to the Barnes and Noble in town, which I think is the only place you could
Yeah.
acquire because we looked online and didn't see anything, and they came back and it was amazing. I had no worry or embarrassment about colleagues thinking I was a sellout. I was just overjoyed for the attention, and it reaches a different kind of audience. And some
Hmm.
of those people have liked the book, and surely not all of them, but I know some of them have because people have written me emails. And it's one thing to have, as you the lead to this question was, what does it feel to be, read by these esteemed reviewers? But it's also amazing to just have your book being read by normal by I don't mean normal to kind of,
Sure. General
minimize
reader.
them, but
Hmm.
general readers,
Hmm.
and some of whom, and I would never do this as a reader, and maybe that says something about me, but are just so generous to take the time to write me and express their feelings about the book. One, a woman from California, her senior center that she lives in, they have like an 8-person book club, and she wrote to tell me that she voted adamantly against my book for being their September book club pick and lost. And she was so upset because she thought this book looked horrible. But she wrote me to tell me how much she loved the book and that she was wrong. And um, I'm hoping, if it works out, to sort of surprise the group and say hello at
Oh, that's
their
terrific.
at their
Wow.
meeting.
Very
So
generous. Wow. What a great story. And not many academic historians will ever be able to tell something like that. Um, so many different questions to ask. And I'll start with this one. It seems to me, um, and you do confirm this somewhat, that owning a bookshop is one of the most romanticized professions in the world. And it turns out that it's very difficult work. Uh, why do you think that is? I mean, you talk to people who, oh, I've always wanted to own a bookshop. And I always think, are you crazy? Because it's hard to do it successfully. And your book, of course, confirms that because so many of these great places, big and small, all wind up in the same place, which is out of business. What is it about the bookshop that seems to it's very romanticized, owning one, running one?
so I think, first of all, yes, it is a very difficult business to run, and historically not been a terribly profitably one, and has had high turnover rates. So there are lots of reasons for us to think that this wouldn't be a position people, had such passion for and romanticized. So I think it is romanticized for, a couple of reasons. One, I think that there's a special relationship that we have with books as human beings. And some of this has to do with our intrinsic interest in storytelling and fables and folk tales and learning and being curious animals. And so books have taken on a kind of, near holy spirit. I have a line in the book about how difficult it is to throw a book in the trash. So they are these near sacred kind of objects that we like to be around. And there are all sorts of sociologists and psychologists that write, stuff about kind of emotional and physical responses to physically holding a book, being surrounded by books. So I think that's not a kind of false fantasy. I think that being surrounded by books is pleasurable and so makes sense in a kind of romantic way to want our lives to be oriented around books and to think of ourselves as someone who's going to dedicate our lives to sharing literature. What kind of higher purpose could there be? So, and of course, popular culture has furthered these romantic notions. And I do write in the book quite a bit about You've Got Mail, which of course creates this villainous image of, a chain corporate bookstore. But even that movie in the end comes around to kind of seeing the charm in all kinds of bookstores. The little shop around the corner that's been closed, but even this new big box bookseller, the movie ends in this kind of upbeat way. So there's a legitimate, charming warmth to bookstores. And the idea of spending a life in a bookstore is a very attractive notion. And at a sort of a distant and first thought, like, well, sure, this would be a great life to have. People assume they'd have a lot of time to read or that they could read on the job.
Right.
That's definitely not true.
Yeah.
Um, but it seems like you would. Like you could just read stuff, tell people what to read, constantly be looking out for new books, talking to people about books. I mean, what's bad about that?
Right. And in the best bookshops, that's exactly what happens. I want to return in a moment to this. The one of the things you brought up about you're as much interested in the spaces themselves, physical places. Um, but first, uh, in the book, you are, it seems to me, both a historian and almost like a reporter, because the book pivots back and forth between history and historic bookshops that are no longer around. But you also go into a lot of current bookshops and you talk to a lot of booksellers, book lovers, book readers. Did you feel that I mean, obviously it was something that you planned to do because this could have been straight up history and it's not. It has a very contemporary, almost a Tony Horwitz, for lack of a better term, the historian who was a writer who went, and talked about the Civil War while living with reenactors. And I don't mean to imply you're doing that, but
Yeah.
in a sense that you were both a reporter and a historian as you were doing
So,
this book.
yeah. So one of my, kind of fundamental questions started from the present day, which historians are sometimes taught to try and suppress those presentist framings. But I was a person I was born in 1980 and grew up with a local Barnes and Noble that I went to in the 1990s in this, you've got mail era and the rise of the superstores and the decline of indies. So this was something I had seen, experienced firsthand. And when I decided I was going to write this book, I knew I was sort of starting from a place of how did this happen? Why have we lost all these bookstores? But also, why does this issue still matter? Why are people trying to save bookstores? What are the stakes? I write somewhere in the book that, if bookstores were animals, they'd be on the endangered species list. And I think that's true. But are they worth all of our research to save them? And why? So that was a real starting point kind of question. So I didn't feel like I didn't want to write a book that just ended at some distant point from today. I wanted to understand the carry through and be able to have it part of a larger contemporaneous discussion about why we need bookstores and why we need places like them. So, but it is challenging to write a history that stretches not just methodologically and organizationally, um, but just to kind of frame it in a way that stretches for hundreds of years and ends up today. And how do you deal with the present? And how much does an author insert, in this case, himself into the narrative? And those are hard questions, and I didn't honestly probably dwell on them as much as one might think. And this is some of the benefit of this being my third book. I felt much more comfortable kind of trusting my instincts and writing it the way that I wanted to, and writing it in a way that I thought was fun and would be maybe hopefully fun for the reader without worrying again about something I might have when I was in graduate school or even just starting out as a professor of like really wanting to be scholarly. Here I was just interested in yeah, in telling a good story and making connections between past and present and trying to make the book relevant, the history relevant to today. One of the concerns is always how are you going to write about people who are still alive? Many of my colleagues
Mm-hmm.
only write about dead people, which has its advantages and disadvantages. You can't talk to them, but you also, as the author, don't have to be worried about how you're going to represent them or how they're going to feel about the kinds of material you include, the way that you describe them, and even just adjectives that most people might read as kind of throwaway descriptors. What is that person going to think about how they're written about. So that makes it complicated and sticky. And so I understand why many historians prefer to divorce themselves from the narrative and prefer to deal with more distant time periods.
Yeah, it's not unlike being a profile writer in a magazine, right? You spend time with your subject and then you have to write about them, knowing they're going to read it. Um, how did you go about? We could go through and talk about all the individual bookstores, almost all of which are no longer around. Um, Traditionally, historians go into the archives and they look at business records and those sorts of things to uncover uh, businesses in the past that no longer exist. How, for instance, did you my favorite chapters was the one on Marshall Field, the department store that had the great third floor, I think it was, bookstore. I'm a little older than you, and I can still remember the first places that I encountered books were department stores. How do you go about uncovering what Marshall Field's bookshop was like? Because presumably, and really I'm asking you, did you find the archives from Marshall Field? Did you just sort of recreate this from newspaper articles? I mean, I went through your bibliography, but for the benefit of our listeners, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, so a lot of the stories that I told and the stores that I profiled, I did because I had enough material, and deciding which, stores would be highlighted in which chapters was one of the most difficult decisions. And sometimes it was made easier because the store that I really wanted to write about, I just didn't have enough material.
Mm,
And Marshall Fields, I thought was fascinating because by the time I grew up, there were plenty of department stores, some maybe kind of glamorous, but they were really mall spaces. I couldn't imagine that they would really have book departments, or if they did, that they would be the envy of kind of booksellers all over. So the idea that Marshall Fields could and did have one of the largest books, essentially bookstores in the country
mm,
inside
mm-hmm.
of it, but that it was also respected as a kind of leading bookstore, even among booksellers, and that its leading buyer and manager, this woman, Marcella Burns Honor, was maybe the most influential bookseller in her era, was a kind of amazing story. And I found the story in, there are Marshall Field and Company records now in the Chicago Historical Society. And probably they've been saved because, first of all, it was such a kind of corporate behemoth with good record keeping. And even if they didn't have archivists, they had a lot of bureaucracy and files and organization systems. And then, of course, Marshall Field doesn't exist anymore in its own entity, but it was bought and rebought, and the materials remain. And it was a little complicated because some of this research was happening during the pandemic, and they were doing then reconstruction in the Chicago Historical Society. But once they opened, I had the sort of first appointment to hop on a plane and went to Chicago in this beautiful setting. And just for days on end, got box after box, folder after folder. And in my case, it was, I wouldn't say easy, but I was really just trying to tell the story of the book department. So it was somewhat easy to filter out a lot of material that I knew was not relevant at all, and came across a lot of images, letters, receipts. The same was true for many of the other bookstores. And it can be challenging as a historian to know, what do I need to pay attention to, and what's going to make it into the book. So a lot of business records, as you mentioned, I found a lot of receipts, inventories, not just at Marshall Field, but bookstores across the country that would just keep, weekly lists of all the books received, which on the one hand seemed like amazing sources that I should somehow interpret and use. And then on the other hand, just became this kind of voluminous nightmare that I didn't want to get too bogged down in just a kind of telling of details about the books that were coming in, or how much profit some bookstore made in the third quarter in 1938. So, I was sifting through those for nuggets and kind of archival evidence that I could use profitably.
You mentioned that Marshall Field is no longer in existence, but is the physical space still there? Were you able to walk through that third floor, whatever it looks like now?
Yeah, it's amazing. The building is still there. It's currently a Macy's is the
Mm,
brand of the, building. And a lot of the beauty is unfortunately gone, but the building itself on the outside looks very much the same. And on the interior, some of the details are very much still alive. So there's this Tiffany glass ceiling that's just spectacular. And I walked through there and I was trying to get a feel for the department. And I had all these images and was kind of walking around. And it was admittedly hard to do because it was filled with, racks of women's clothes. Um, and just the style was so distinct from what it was. But there is a bookstore in the basement called Barber's, which is a small chain, an independent Chicago bookstore with a few branches, and one is in the basement of Marshall Fields, which I went to, and does pay some respect to the old Marshall Field book department. So there's some historical images and prints that are up on the wall, which is a nice touch.
hmm So but you were actually able to walk through that third floor space that you
Yeah,
described
I
so
was.
eloquently. Yeah.
And I just wish that I could talk to Marcella Burns Honor.
She's the one I
or
think who brought an elephant up on the third floor, right?
Yes, so in I think it was 1944, Judy the elephant came to sign books using her trunk, and it turned into this fiasco because Judy didn't want to leave. I mean, who wants to leave Marshall Fields?
Right.
And they had to, kind of push her toward the freight elevator, and that inspired a children's book of its own about this a stubborn elephant.
She was really an amazing figure, as you say. She not only sold books, became very influential with publishers, but with authors. I mean, Christopher Morley was a close friend. She had close friends. Do her archives still exist somewhere? Her correspondence, is it still out there?
Not too much. There's an occasional letter from her in people like Christopher Morley's papers,
Mm,
that exist that way.
hmm
And there's material from her written, behind her desk at Marshall Fields, which I saw, but
hmm
not that I know of a personal collection of her material. But one of the interesting things was that she and this other woman, Frances Steloff, at the Gotham Book Mart,
hmm
were probably two of the most conspicuous figures in American bookselling for, 40 years. And these are two women in a
hmm
industry dominated by men. So the publishers and, Random House and Viking and all Simon and Schuster, these are all men. And of course, many of the authors are still skewing male.
hmm
But both of them, and there's a lot of crossover between the two of them, were not just the faces of two incredibly important and influential bookstores, but like you say, they influenced books and publishing, and they befriended many authors. They could literally pick up the phone and call, the founder of Random House, which they did, and say, you need to publish a book by this person, or you need to come out with another edition of this, or why aren't there any books about this, or I don't like the cover of this book. And they would do this acting as almost like agents, for some of
hmm
these friends of theirs who were
hmm
authors who just hung out in these places. And they made a name. They helped authors make a name for themselves when they wanted to, and they
hmm
could they could make a book fail also. An arty book, some kind of avant-garde writer who's not carried at the Gotham Book Mart is not going to be carried anywhere, and some best-selling author is not going to be a best-selling author if it's not at Marshall Field and Company.
I was the moment you said that, I was thinking about how in the old days of the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, a comic could go on there and he would make or break their career. And I was going to say these same people, if they featured a book, if they had an author signing, which they often did, it could make or break their career. It could put
Yeah.
people
And a
in the
lot,
stratosphere. Yeah.
yeah, a lot of times people would hear, or I don't know, word would leak out about the kind of size of a Marshall Field order, and other bookstores would follow suit. So it would
Mm-hmm.
sometimes be publicized. Marcella Honner's ordering 2,000 copies of this book, and that would make Publishers Weekly or some other kind of trade magazine, and other
Mm-hmm.
people would see that and follow.
It had its own algorithm, so to speak. Yeah.
That's right.
Wow. So a lot of different space. You answered one of the questions I was going to ask, which is, were there some bookshops you wanted to write about but couldn't because it just simply wasn't enough there? But also, it seemed important that you were able to walk through the physical spaces where you could, even for bookshops. That, in fact, some of your chapters, I thought, is this place still there or it isn't? Because while you were describing it, it sounded like you had been there. So I was sort of surprised to read about drums and spears, for instance. That one
Yeah.
example of you such a vivid, and the picture that you've chosen looks remarkably modern and could be. So you're
Yeah.
stunned to find out that it's been closed for 40 years or something like that.
Well, in a book about bookstores, at least in my imagination, I really wanted to do justice to the spaces, and the nicest things that people have said about the book are that it makes them feel like they're walking into a bookstore, which was very much intentional. So
Mm-hmm.
I was
Mm-hmm.
trying to capture, detail and atmosphere to the degree to which one could, while also being honest to the historical record. So when I was pitching this book, and you asked earlier about whether it was academic or trade, one of the things I was excited about doing a commercial book for the obvious reasons. But I was also worried that some agents or editors either A, wouldn't want all these endnotes, which, by the way, you can't see in the middle of the book. There are no numbers indicating that they're endnotes. So it's a very clean look. But I assure you, there's over 1,000 endnotes in the back of the book with lots and lots of resources. So
Yes.
that was important to me. And I wanted the work to be serious nonfiction from, a real historian who's not going to, let's say, embellish or exaggerate or looking for details for color, just kind of fill stuff in. So um it's a hard thing to do, and I was just trying to find the right balance of being descriptive, of creating scenes and atmosphere and color, while also doing so from the sources that I had. um
Have you heard from any booksellers who've written to you complaining that you left them out? How dare you?
um I've gotten a lot of responses with people saying, "I love this book, it's great. I think you should have also mentioned," and then, so
The
and so.
tattered the tattered cover in Denver, right? Something
Yes, the
like that.
tattered
Yeah.
cover is in there, but very briefly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Powell's is in there, but it's not like a whole chapter. And
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of good reason. Not, I mean, there's lots of good reasons to complain about the omissions, and I have my own complaints about the omissions. There is a line in the introduction that's supposed to be a disclaimer, and I say something to the effect of, I know there are readers who are going to immediately go to the index and look for mention of their favorite bookstore,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to be upset when they don't find it. But I say, the fact that they're upset is really the part of the story I want to emphasize. Like that they're looking in the index, that they really feel strongly
Right.
that some bookstore isn't included, is really part of my whole point. That these are institutions to which people have a distinct and special relationship to.
Have you had a lot of requests from small bookshops? For instance, I'm in Savannah, and we have a terrific independent bookseller here who thrives on the tourist trade, and it's a great shop. But have you had a lot of invitations? Hey, Evan, come down and sign books at our shop here and all over the country.
Yeah, and it's been amazing, and I'm very grateful for it. And I just wish I had time to do it all or the resources. So there are plenty of times when somebody has invited me somewhere, but they don't necessarily have the funds, which I understand, to pay for me to go. And
Yeah.
I don't want to spend my own money to, go sign a handful of books somewhere
Mhm.
necessarily. So I feel sometimes, remiss about these opportunities, and I also just walk into bookstores. So I was doing some book promo stuff in Washington and New York. And every time I pass a bookstore, I keep a pen on me and I walk in and I'm still used to being a nobody. And the first two books that I wrote, they just came out. And the day they came out, I ate breakfast and, went to work or whatever. Nothing really happened. But this one was different anyway.
Mhm.
So I'm always like, first, I just assume they're not going to have the book in the bookstore. And then I don't know how to navigate this conversation, but I usually either find the book and then say I'm the author or ask them. And I've probably been to 20 bookstores unannounced, and everyone has had the book. And usually they knew it many times. It's prominently displayed, and it's amazing. And they're happy to have a signed copy. So I just sign what's there and
Mhm.
chat with the booksellers, and it's a very gratifying experience. And I keep reminding myself how lucky and privileged I am, because I am well aware of how many books exist in the market and how hard it is for any book to make it into a bookstore.
Mhm. One of the things I noticed right away is you very rarely make a distinction when you're describing a bookstore if it's a bookstore that sells exclusively used books. And I know as a historian, you love to go, I just like I do. We all do, to go into those used bookstores and prowl those stacks. And a store that sells only new books. In fact, reading about many of these, obviously a place like Marshall Field, you're selling new books. It's a big bookstore in the same way that Borders, while selling, of course, books that aren't just new. But did you have to make a distinction between the great bookstores that are known primarily as those great used places and places that sell only new books? And did you say, I'm not gonna, it's a bookshop. I'm not going to talk about the kinds of things that they sell
Yeah,
unless they
it's
specialize.
yeah, it was at times difficult and blurry to sometimes make those distinctions. So I have one chapter that profiles almost all used booksellers in New York,
Mm-hmm.
that's anchored around the Strand, which was for a very long time only used books and was
Mm-hmm.
part of what was called Booksellers Row in New York, which again weren't exclusively used, but almost all of them were used shops of different specialties. And it was
Mm-hmm.
known very much as a sort of landscape for used books. But even that, when you use the word used, it hits people different ways, because some people think of antiquarian books, that are high end,
Right.
expensive, first editions that are collectors kind of things. And
Mm-hmm.
many of us in more modern times think of used books as just, $2, $3 books that are popular books that have been left over. So they're really different kinds of shops, even though they're both used.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Strand ends up selling, and nowadays sells lots and lots of new books in addition to used. And the same is true for Powell's and some of the other big stores that used to be either all used or more heavily used. They've sort of switched over. So there are plenty of places that have done both. Even the Gotham Book Mart, which mostly sold new books for a number of years, also sold some used books. Um, and there are of course differences in how one acquires one stock. I write a bit about sidewalk booksellers, which are of
Mm-hmm.
course they're dealing all in used, but I didn't really frame them as used bookstores so much, because they're of course different than the Strand and the like. But they are of course selling books that are not new, even though some of them did sell remainders, which were new books basically that were just, there were too many copies or overprinted from the publisher. But
Mm-hmm.
most of what they were selling was used, and it's different, a different kind of clientele, a different kind of market. You're not necessarily dealing directly with publishers, and the effect of Amazon, eBay hit those shops somewhat differently than the others.
So I have to ask you about Amazon. I'm sure you every interview you do, this comes up. They're not exactly. I'm. I don't think they're the villain of this book, but they are sort of the anti-bookshop, and yet it's no surprise that this is where a lot of people get their books these days, including your book, right? And you probably had people ask you, "Do you mind if I buy your book on Amazon?"
I have had people apologize and
Yeah,
say, I bought your book. Like they want credit for that. But
yeah.
I probably should have bought it at my local indie. And I tell them, I'm not judging their behavior. People can make their own decisions. But you're absolutely right that writing about Amazon was one of the trickier parts in this history. And it was the thing that when I was pitching it to agents and editors, that they brought up the most. And it was just a challenge of how to do it. Is this book just going to be a kind of love letter to bookstores and ignore Amazon and is going to be all, further this romantic trope
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
maybe a lot of people would like and buy, but I didn't want to write a book like that, even if I admire booksellers and love bookstores. I also, wanted to acknowledge the transformational changes and also some of the ways in which book selling and bookstores have had negative effects, which is why I included a chapter on a Nazi bookstore, which, was in many ways similar to other civil rights bookstores
Mm-hmm.
insofar as it was promoting an ideology. It's just one, that we find detestful. But the idea was the same that a bookstore can be a community space, a place to disseminate literature, influence people, etc. So how is I going to talk about Amazon? Should I have a whole chapter about it? Should it just weave its way in and out? And I decided because of the framing of the book is mostly these kind of different important types of bookstores at a given moment that I could talk about Amazon if I started with the kind of brick and mortar bookstore experiment of theirs as a way to talk about the company more broadly. And I think it's a fair assessment, but I'll let the readers decide. And it's certainly true that many Americans have long been distant from any bookstore, and that Amazon has provided often cheaper books, faster books to everyone and anyone in a way bookstores could never do, and has opened up publishing. And we could argue about the all the advantages and disadvantages of, every author has a platform, but you can self-publish a book on there and try and find an audience. And, I think there's some benefit to that. And some of the bookstores that are succeeding today are doing so also because of Amazon. People are making a choice, and everybody, it's not a secret. That was the other reason I wanted to write about Amazon. It wasn't like every reader was going to think about Amazon at some point
Mm-hmm.
anyway. And everyone walking into a bookstore today knows they can get the same exact product online. And all of the people who are today buying a book out in the real world are making a choice to do so. And, why are they making that choice? And that's part of what I try to illuminate in the book.
And you mentioned this, and I thought as I was reading it, I wonder. I mean, it is tricky because your publisher, Viking, I'm sure loves to sell books on Amazon.
Yeah,
So
it's a huge portion of the market,
mhm.
necessary portion of the market. I talk a very small bit about the way in which book design changes alongside bookstores. And, in the earliest days, bookstores are not browsable spaces. The books are behind cupboards or there's moats separating the books and the browsers. But when they become browsable spaces, the publishers have to think about how to make their book attractive. Why is someone going to pick up this book instead of another one? They come up with colorful bindings and all these kind of things. But now it's, art directors who are coming up with cover designs have to decide how it looks on a screen, right? Most people are going to see the book front cover only
Hmm.
of the jacket on Amazon. What does that look like? How does it read on a screen? That's as or more important than anything else. And during the pandemic, of course, when many bookstores were closed, publishers had never been so thankful for Amazon. In my book, which I'm sure skews and sells better relatively at independent bookstores than Amazon compared to the average book because of the subject matter, is still selling a significant number of copies that are benefiting me and the publisher on Amazon. And it's a huge market. We have little, I can't remember, and I try not to look too often at my little author portal, which can tell you like how many books have shipped out and how many have shipped out to wholesalers and online retailers and indie bookstores and. But the online number is is large, very large.
Hmm. I have to say, one of my favorite lines of yours in this entire book is on the chapter on Amazon when you're talking about Jeff Bezos. And you said, then came the Kindle, Amazon's ebook reader. At its fall 2007 debut, Bezos in khakis and a sport coat. And you said he didn't adopt his younger look until he was older. I starred and underlined that, and I've used it over and over. It was just such a great line.
Well,
So I
thanks.
commend you for that. I just thought that was a real great dig that he was normal, right? Until he got older and decided that he
Yeah.
wanted to. Yeah.
He's a fascinating figure, and I
Yeah.
knew a little about him before I started doing the research. And I tried to interview a lot of high level Amazon people and was mostly rebuffed. I did interview one person who was centrally involved in their brick and mortar bookstore project, which was helpful. Um, but everybody who does know him, they say similar things about his intensity and, drive, but also that he's just brilliant person. And was sort of to many people seemed destined to have success in some way. And one of the most interesting Bezos stories I came across was interviewing another legendary person, a guy named Len Riggio, who was the person who turned Barnes and Noble into a household name. When he bought it, it was this regional bookstore that sold mostly college books in New York. And he was such a charismatic figure. He recently passed away,
Hmm.
and he let me interview him. I'm pretty sure because he thought I was a friend of a friend. I don't know. I asked my editor if he could score me. And, I tried through the normal channels and was rebuffed. And he didn't like to do interviews because he had been villainized by so
Hmm.
many people in the press as the killer of indie bookstores. So I asked my editor, and he had a friend, some other editor who was friends with him. Anyway, so I walk into his office on Fifth Avenue, which is really an art gallery. And he's like, "Hey, how's Steve doing?" And I'm like, he's great. All right, he's great." And then we had a long afternoon together. But the most interesting thing he talked to me about, and I hadn't seen reference to this elsewhere, was that he was so impressed with Jeff Bezos. He flew to Seattle, took him out to a steak dinner, and offered to buy Amazon on the spot. This was like, you know, Amazon was like 2 years old or something,
Mm.
very in its very early days. And there's a line I do write about it in the book, but basically Len Riggio says, I'm not nearly as smart as Bezos was, and I would have screwed up Amazon entirely. And it's
Hmm.
to everyone's benefit that he just said no. But that was a pretty it was I don't I hope that I'll never forget that moment of Len Riggio just sort of casually talking about how he casually tried to buy Amazon. It
Hmm.
was one of these moments when I felt like I was where am I? What am I doing here? I don't usually converse with billionaires, but it was a special experience. And he also was a figure when I met him. He was so charismatic and so energetic that it wasn't hard for me to imagine that this was the person who built, you know, a multi-billion-dollar company.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, so
he
there are
he,
people
he
like that. I'm not one of those
that,
people.
well, and that was one of the reasons I asked you about being a reporter. I mean, when you're sitting with someone like that, you're right. Historians usually don't get anywhere close to something like that. And the only reason when I saw his obituary in the New York Times, I thought, I know him because of your book. And instantly went to it and read it because you're right. He was vilified, right, as someone who was killing these small bookstores, and then he was looked to as God, you have to save us, right, from Amazon. We're
Mhm.
all going down, and Barnes and Noble is going to have to be the one thing that keeps us all afloat here. So he plays several different roles in your book. Um, so what's next for Evan Friss? This this seems like this might take you a
Do you
long
have any
way.
ideas, Dan? Does
Well,
the Georgia Historical Society have any unloved collections, or you have any ones that have gifted donor agreements that are coming, out of
they're
date?
opening up. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure that we do. One of the things that I was fascinated by, you do write a good bit about Christopher Morley and some of the other people like him,
Hmm.
authors from earlier centuries. Even struck by how many, and we could talk about this, how many of these central figures in your book are women, so important in the book field. I wondered if you had any inclination to write biographies of any of these people. I have always felt the world is dying, needs a good biography of Christopher Morley. And I know his papers sit there at the University of Texas at Austin.
Yeah.
We even mentioned the signed door. I loved that. You put that
Yes.
not in the notes, but right in the text. The signed
Yeah.
door.
Morley is a
Frank
fascinating
Shea's
figure.
bookshop is still there. God, that was
Yeah.
just a great point in that book. I loved it.
Thanks. Morley, who I knew of a bit before doing this research, just
Hmm.
showed up in every in every archive. And he's really the kind of like bookstore glue in this for a
Yeah.
long period of time. So he hangs out at the Gotham Book Mart all the time. He's got deep connections to Marshall Field and Company. And as you mentioned, I have this chapter on traveling bookstores,
Mm-hmm.
which were inspired by his own book, Parnassus on Wheels, where it's amazing. There are these whole armies of bookmobiles. And you mentioned earlier about this romanticized notion of book selling. I mean, there's nothing more romanticized than the idea of a kind of traveling book van or, then pulled by horse. And people read the book and then said, I'm doing this. And he was sort of standing on the sidelines watching them saying, okay, including his buddy Frank Shea, who had this
Mm.
bohemian bookstore where he and others, as a kind of I don't know, sort of almost in a museum kind of way, signed the door that became legendary, and lives on at the
Hmm.
University of Texas at Austin. So yeah, and I do like biography. I've never written one, but I've always been drawn to it. And some of my favorite parts of the research and writing was about, digging through the papers and trying to bring people, to try to make sense of their lives as individuals and to introduce readers to some characters that they may not have known about or much about before. So
Hmm.
I am drawn to that. I have some ideas, um, but and maybe this is normal. I don't know. I always feel like every book idea I have is the last one, and that I'll never be able to come up with another good idea. But
Right. Yeah.
I have a list of I don't know, five or six somewhat viable, seemingly somewhat viable options. And now that I have an agent, that's also very helpful because she's been encouraging me to
Hmm.
push the next project and read stuff that I've written about it. So nothing to announce here yet, but I'll come back on, Stan, when
I,
I'm
I,
when I'm
I
promoting the next book, whatever
I
that
would
is.
love for you to do that. We could talk for several more hours about this book. The book is entitled The Bookshop, A History of the Bookstore, of the American Bookstore, published by Viking. The author is Evan Friss. Evan, thank you so much for taking time to come on the podcast. It has been a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Thanks so much for having me, all the great questions, and your own enthusiasm for the book. I really honestly appreciate it.
Thank you. My thanks to Evan Friss for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at penguinrandomhouse.com and at evanfriss.com. That's EVANFRISS. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the GHS Snow Polo team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The GHS Director of Accounts Payable is Bill Schroeder. The Off the Beaten Path stock market predictor is Luigi Board. The GHS table saw operator is Les Digits. Our Director of Employee Loyalty is Upton Leftus. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verdurci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar LaVista. Our insurance claims liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our customer care specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. Our complaints coordinator is Stella Payne Diaz. Our IRS liaison is Major Payne Diaz. And our gastroenterologist is Cameron Diaz. The official Off the Beaten Path cheese expert is Gordon Zola. The GHS summer wardrobe consultant is Bermuda Schwartz. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iappoca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff, and our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including the podcast app on your iPhone and now on YouTube and YouTube Music. You can find out everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Please also visit deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, my blog, and similar something for every reading taste podcast like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.